Today we're going to talk about the Renaissance, which is the cultural movement that ended the Middle Ages and marked the beginning of the modern era. Here are your terms. Make sure you get them down. The term Renaissance means rebirth, and it refers to Europe's cultural rebirth starting around the year 1350. Now, this is an approximation. It doesn't mean that on January 1st of 1350 people woke up and they're like, oh, it's a new age, it's the Renaissance. No, rather it was a gradual movement that began in Italy and then eventually will begin to make its way throughout much of the rest of Europe. It's going to last until roughly 1600. And during this time, artists and intellectuals themselves actually did use the term Renaissance to indicate the difference between their world and the world of the Dark Ages. And that term is sometimes used to cover the period from the fall of Rome in 476 until the mid-1300s. Renaissance intellectuals and artists believed that they had rediscovered the lost cultural legacy of Greece and Rome. And, as we've seen, the cultural legacy of the classical world really had never been completely lost. Think of the Byzantine Empire, for example. But the term Renaissance is still useful to describe a series of interrelated cultural and artistic developments that began in Italy in the mid-1300s and then spread to Northern Europe in the late 1400s and early 1500s. Now, scholars in the 1200s knew classical works not only through the efforts of people like Boethius and the Benedictine monks, but also because of translations by Arab and Hebrew scholars and subsequent writings of people like St. Thomas Aquinas. So this is sometimes called classicism. What distinguished this period of the Renaissance from that of the High Middle Ages? Well, knowledge of Greek became even more widely diffused among an even larger group of scholars, so that we have more scholars studying the classics than they had in previous centuries. Also, during this period, you have to consider what's going on over towards the east in the Byzantine Empire. They're really starting to fail. We have attacks at their borders, their empire shrinking. And so we see scholars moving back to the West, many of them bringing these classical works with them. And in fact, in the Muslim state in Toledo in Spain, there was a great library, one of the greatest of its times in Europe. And you have scholars, Muslim, Christian, Jewish alike, traveling to Toledo to study, and they're coming into contact with many of these classical works. And then also, Renaissance scholars faced relatively less pressure to filter all aspects of classicism through Christian doctrine. Remember, during the Middle Ages, it's the age of faith. Everything is seen through the lens of the church. But now that begins to change. Now, don't get me wrong, people were still very religious. But even so, many of them tended to treat the classical world as distinct from the Christian era because they believed that it offered lessons of its own. And that helps to make the Renaissance and the classicism of this time fairly secular in its outlook. Now, it's also important to realize that the beginning of the Renaissance period overlapped the end of the Middle Ages. Northern Italy was in the forefront. As it enters the Renaissance, you've got to realize that the rest of Europe is still, I guess you could say, best described as being in the late Middle Ages. The Renaissance was a time of creativity and change in many areas, political, social, economic, cultural. Perhaps most important, though, were the changes that took place in the way people viewed themselves and their world. And spurred by this reawakened interest in classical learning, creative Renaissance minds set out to transform their own age. Their era, they felt, was a time of rebirth after the disorder and disunity of the medieval world. But Renaissance Europe didn't completely break with its medieval past, because there were periods during the Middle Ages where some of the classical heritage had been preserved. Latin, for example, had survived as the language of the church and of educated people. The mathematics of Euclid, the astronomy of Ptolemy, the works of Aristotle were well known to medieval scholars. But the Renaissance produced new attitudes towards culture and learning. Unlike medieval scholars who debated the nature of life after death, Renaissance thinkers were eager to explore the richness and variety of the human experience in the here and now. So some of the main ideas of this period are the rediscovery of the classical world, humanism, which we'll talk about shortly. We see a spread of ideas and the creation of a more secular world. We see a new worldview being created. People looked at the world differently, and they began to ask and answer basic questions. What are humans? Who are we? Why are we here? What's our purpose in life? And these are the same questions people ask today, so not much has changed. Now, one reason for this is the bubonic plague. If you recall, it hit Italy in 1347. So as the Renaissance is beginning, Italy is starting to recover from the plague, and people are changing the way they view the world, and they're beginning to question. They're beginning to question the idea of living their entire life just trying to get to the next life, the afterlife. And they begin to believe that maybe they should take the time to enjoy and experience the life they have now. And this is what lays the groundwork for the idea of humanism. The essence of the Renaissance was an intellectual movement called humanism, which contrasts with the emphasis of medieval times on a careful hierarchy with God on top. The idea of humanism is that the humans, people, are center stage. Now, the leading figures of the Renaissance were generally deeply religious, but they took as their main subject of study the study of man rather than that of God, and their perspective became known as humanism. Now, humanists did not doubt the existence of God, but rather emphasized human capabilities and celebrated individual achievement and genius. Now, Shakespeare actually comes along at the very end of the Renaissance, and even was writing after the traditional dates of the Renaissance, but he's considered to be a figure of the Renaissance, partly because of his ideas, because he really expressed this idea of humanism through his writing. And if you've ever read Hamlet, which was written just like at the very end of the Renaissance, Hamlet describes mankind in terms that are just steeped in humanism. He says, "What a piece of work is a man! How noble is reason, how infinite in faculty, in form, in moving, how express and admirable, in action, how like an angel," and so on and so on. So these are examples of humanism. Humanists question the authenticity of scholasticism with its concentration on abstract logic and the philosophy of Aristotle. Instead, they champion the study of the humanities, history, literature, language and rhetoric, ethics, all subjects concerned with human experience. For Renaissance humanists, the humans worthy of study were the men of classical Greece and Rome. And here you see an example of a piece of art from the Renaissance, with, as I said, humans taking center stage. Now, the art of the Middle Ages would almost exclusively have a solid religious theme. And we do see religious themes throughout the Renaissance, sometimes solely religious, but also often mixed with this idea of humans being involved. So the way of thinking during the Renaissance shifts completely, moving away from this medieval worldview where the focus is on God and the church, and that's it, where your every action is devoted to a religious purpose. In medieval thought, humans were thought to be hopelessly sinful and constantly striving to improve their souls. The only truth was divine truth. And because of this, the Middle Ages was sometimes called an otherworldly time because eyes were focused on the world beyond death as opposed to the world right now. The Renaissance takes a different tack. Instead of the divine and the accompanying look upward as being the center of men's lives, humans now take the center role. Humans and their lives in this world, and that's that idea of humanism. There's a renewed emphasis on antiquity, focusing on the pre-Christian era, on the Greeks, and especially on the Romans. In fact, to the people living during the Renaissance, ancient Rome was the height of classical civilization. Their perspective, the Greeks and the Romans, was not a Christian perspective, but their perspective came to replace the medieval God-centered focus of the universe. Humanists looked to the ancient classics for insight into human character. The focus was on what can be achieved in this life by the individual and the community. The Renaissance was a time of greater emphasis on individual accomplishments and ambitious endeavors, usually in artistic or intellectual areas. That is where the term Renaissance man comes from. The Renaissance man was a person who was multi-talented in many areas. He wasn't just a great painter. He was a sculptor. He was an inventor. He could compose music, and so on and so on. And maybe one of the best examples is Leonardo da Vinci, who was most of those things I just mentioned. But this is what people were striving for. Gaining a personal reputation by greatness in a particular field was now considered to be a great honor. It didn't have to have a religious purpose. The pursuit of personal excellence, not in relation to God, becomes a goal in itself. Education becomes very important during this time, and humanists believed that education should stimulate the individual's creative powers. So they returned to the study of the humanities, as I mentioned a few moments ago, because these were the subjects taught in ancient Greek and Roman schools. And humanists, they studied these things, these ideas, but they did not just accept the classical text without question. Rather, they studied the ancient authorities in light of their own experience. So you have to ask, why Italy? Why does the Renaissance begin in Italy? Well, the Renaissance was marked by a reawakened interest in the culture of ancient Rome. Since Italy was the center of ancient Roman history, it was only natural for this reawakening to start there, because the people are surrounded by the visible remains of what was once the glory of ancient Rome. You've got architectural remains, antique statues, coins, inscriptions. All were visible reminders to Italians of, as I said, the glory that was Rome. And here you see another example, and yet another. Also, Italy differed from the rest of Europe in another important way. Italy's cities had survived the Middle Ages, and in the northern part of Italy, city-states like Florence, Milan, Venice, and Genoa grew into prosperous centers of trade and manufacturing, and that is where the Renaissance begins. In these cities, we see urban-based aristocrat families who had melded with the wealthy non-aristocratic merchants and bankers, and both groups of elites placed a lot of value on education. So for the northern Italian cities, education was critical to dominance in the world of commerce, but also in civic affairs, for example, political power. As a consequence, the northern Italian cities became centers of universities and schools over which the church, which was fairly weak in that region, really didn't have a lot of control. We see booming commerce in the Italian city-states that gave city governments, trade and merchant guilds, and wealthy elites enough wealth to patronize or employ large numbers of painters, sculptors, architects, poets, and scholars. Now, the plague begins in Italy. It runs its course, and then it moves on to the rest of Europe. So these northern Italian city-states are able to recover fairly quickly. And so they're recovering, they're back in business, business is booming, while the rest of Europe is still suffering from the plague. But what that means, like I said, is that they have the wealth to support the artists. In the early 1400s, the guilds and city councils of these northern Italian cities competed with one another, in fact, to commission works of art that would reflect the greatness and glory of their city, their trade, and so on. In the late 1400s, the princely families that had consolidated their political power in the city-states became the most patrons of Renaissance artists and intellectuals. So it's this wealth that they have that allows them to support art. Another way that Italy differed from much of the rest of Europe was in the form of government. So this is a period when all throughout the rest of Europe we see monarchs, very powerful monarchs, consolidating their kingdoms, securing their borders, consolidating their power. But it's different in Italy. Italy is not unified. It's not been unified since Rome fell, and it will not be unified until 1871. So during this period that we're talking about, what we see are many independent city-states and smaller states. And many of them have republican forms of government. So I mentioned these businessmen coming together. Many of them hold power. But what that meant was we see generally more freedoms in these republican states than we would see elsewhere. During this time, we begin to see the rise of banking and financial resources in Italy. We see the lending of money and the growth of urban areas. And as I just said, the Italian city-states were mostly independent, although some of them owed just some nominal allegiance to the Holy Roman Empire. But they were republics. I will say, however, that you should not confuse them with actual democracies. What it really means when I say republic here is that there were no hereditary monarchs or religious rulers, but the republics were usually ruled as an oligarchy with a group of government officials who would be elected for some time. There might be a council of citizens to help, and these governments had more of a representative feel to them than the monarchies of the time, more of a sense that the populace determined the direction the cities would take. So these republics represented local rule to a large extent, and probably the best run republic of the time and the most famous was the city of Florence. Florence had one of the most famous republican governments of the time, although eventually it will be under the control of one family. But Florence, more than any other city, came to symbolize the Italian Renaissance. Like ancient Athens, it produced a dazzling number of gifted poets, artists, architects, scholars, scientists, all in a very short period of time. In the 1400s, the Medici family of Florence rose to the forefront. Now, this is a family that is going to really dominate Florence for centuries, up until the early 1700s. They're also going to extend their power beyond Florence to other areas, for example, Tuscany. This family becomes very wealthy through business, starting with banking. They organized a banking business. The business prospered. The family expanded into wool manufacturing, mining, and other ventures. And soon, the Medici family ranked among the richest merchants and bankers in Europe. And this is in the 1400s, the early 1400s. And what they discovered was that money translated into cultural and political power. Cosimo de' Medici gained control of Florence and the government in 1434, and the family will continue as uncrowned rulers of the city for many years. And Cosimo actually set up a system where his heirs would take power after him. And just to give you an idea of how powerful this family was, they're going to marry into other powerful families in Europe. We're going to see two French queens from the Medici family. We're going to see four popes from the Medici family. So this is a family that had a lot of clout. Best known of all the Medicis was Cosimo's grandson, Lorenzo. He was known as Lorenzo the Magnificent. He died in 1492, and he represented the Renaissance ideal. He was a clever politician who held Florence together during difficult times. He was a Renaissance man. He was a great athlete. He composed poetry. He dabbled in art. He's what people wanted to be. He was a generous patron or financial supporter of the arts, and under Lorenzo, poets and philosophers frequently visited the Medici palace. Now, during this time, classical education became more and more important, and this is something that Lorenzo also promoted. But people realized there was a vocational need for it. Governments were expanding and national states were forming across Europe. I want to look at some of the great names of the Renaissance, starting with Francesco Petrarch. He was from Florence, and he lived from 1304 to 1374. He was an early Renaissance humanist. Now, Petrarch had had a great love of Roman classics ever since he was a child, and he had collected Roman and Greek manuscripts, even though he couldn't always read them. His father wanted him to study law, which he did, but his heart wasn't in it. And so after his father died, he abandoned the study of law and began to live the life of an intellectual and a poet. And Petrarch really became known for the love poetry that he wrote in the vernacular, meaning the language of the people, or Italian. Evidently, Petrarch spent years pining for a young woman named Laura. And he wrote a lot of poetry about her and dedicated to her. And they were compiled into a volume known as, or called, Sonnets to Laura. So the reason I'm mentioning this is because his poetry, the style in which he writes, is going to greatly influence other writers of his time. He wrote his thoughts and feelings down on paper, and this is an example of humanism. Now, I will say that historians don't know if Laura even knew him or had ever met him. So we don't know if he and Laura were acquaintances, and we do know that she was married, but we don't know if Petrarch and Laura were acquaintances or if he's just loving her from afar. And if that's the case, he's kind of like a stalker, if you think about it, kind of watching her every move, writing down his thoughts and feelings pertaining to her and what she's doing. But he's one of the very first people to do this, and that's one reason we're talking about him. He also believed that a classical education was essential in society at this time. And through his efforts, as well as the efforts of others who were encouraged by his example, we see a lot of ancient writings becoming known to Western Europeans. For example, the speeches of Cicero, the poems of Homer and Virgil, Livy's History of Rome. Once again, they resurface and people are reading them and talking about them. One of the great examples of the classical pursuit was Pico della Mirandola. He lived from 1463 to 1494, and he believed that there was a creative force placed within each person, and each person should develop that creative spark, that force, the talents that he or she possessed. And this is one of the big ideas of the Renaissance, that you have some talent, you need to nurture it and then use it. We see new ideas emerging in many areas, not just poetry or philosophy or art, but also politics. The best example of the new political philosophy was Niccolo Machiavelli. Machiavelli had served Florence as a diplomat, and he had observed kings and princes in foreign courts. He also had been an avid student of ancient Roman history. In The Prince, published in 1513, Machiavelli combined his personal experience of politics with his knowledge of the past to offer a guide to rulers on how to gain and maintain power. The Prince is essentially an advice book for princes or rulers, providing instructions for how to get by, how to succeed, how to be a great prince, how to prosper, and he does all of this applying learning of the ancient authors. Machiavelli relied heavily on ancient authors in order to prove his case, and some of his ideas at that time were considered to be pretty inflammatory. For example, he says that deceit, even downright nastiness, might be necessary to succeed as a prince. It was gritty, cynical, but effective advice. Image is important to the prince, as is the appearance of virtue, if not virtue itself. And so he doesn't explicitly state this in the book, but one of the big ideas of what he's saying is the end justifies the means, meaning it's that end result that really matters, and that end result in reaching it justifies the actions you take, the steps you take to get there. That can be a very dangerous way to think if you think about it. Because many of the ideas that he writes about were considered to be pretty inflammatory, his book was banned, at the time. It'll resurface later and become a bestseller, and you'll see as you read it that many of the ideas that he talks about aren't ideas that are unique to his time. They're ideas that politicians and individuals have practiced for centuries and still continue to practice to this very day. Now, one story goes that Machiavelli had lost his position of power in the Florentine court. He was involved in a scandal. He wanted his job back. He wanted power back. And so he supposedly wrote The Prince, dedicated it to Lorenzo de' Medici, and who actually had passed away before the book was published, but dedicated it to him and the family in the hopes of regaining his position of power. Doesn't really work, but the ideas the book contains live on. The Renaissance reached its most glorious expression in its paintings, sculpture, and architecture. Wealthy patrons played a major role in this artistic flowering. Popes and princes supported the work of hundreds of artists. Renaissance art reflected humanistic concerns. Like artists of the Middle Ages, Renaissance artists portrayed religious figures like Mary, Jesus, and the saints, but they often set these figures against Greek or Roman backgrounds. Painters also produced paintings of well-known figures of the day, reflecting the humanist interest in individual achievement. Renaissance artists studied ancient Greek and Roman works and revived many classical forms. For example, the sculptor Donatello created a life-size statue of a soldier on horseback, and this was the first such figure done since ancient times. Roman art had been very realistic. Art of the Middle Ages, not quite so much. During the Middle Ages, we see a definite lack of perspective in the majority of the art, and here you see an example. And here you see another, a very beautiful painting, but not entirely realistic. This is Mary and the baby Jesus. However, does that look like a human baby? And yet another, note the lack of perspective in terms of size, with the humans being larger in some cases than the walls of the city. Another difference that we see is in regards to themes of the art. During the Middle Ages, the theme is religious. So you're not going to generally see people having their portraits painted or just slices of life. There's going to be a religious theme to whatever art is produced. All of this changes during the Renaissance, though. Renaissance painters developed new techniques for representing both humans and landscapes in a realistic way. Renaissance artists learned the rules of perspective. By making distant objects smaller than those closer to the viewer, artists could paint scenes that appeared three-dimensional. They also used shading to make objects look round and real. Renaissance artists studied human anatomy and drew from live models. This made it possible for them to portray the human body more accurately than medieval artists had done. Italy is going to be the birthplace of the Renaissance, as I've mentioned, and this is where these ideas are going to flourish. One thing we see in the Italian art is a mixture of themes. So you're still going to see a lot of Christian themes, sometimes on their own, but often mixed with mythological themes. And you see an example of that here. And I'm just going to show you a few examples. So as you can see, this looks much more realistic than some of the earlier pieces I showed you. And another. One of the most famous works of the Renaissance was the Sistine Chapel, painted by Michelangelo, who was from Florence. So this chapel was originally built in 1479 by Pope Sixtus IV, and that's where the name Sistine comes from. In fact, Sistine derives from his name Sixtus. And he built this as a gathering place for cardinals and high church officials whenever they would come together to elect popes or just do church business. And originally the ceiling was painted blue with yellow or golden stars, but later we're going to have another pope, Pope Julius I, and in 1508 he decides that he wants to change this. So he hires Michelangelo to paint the ceiling of the church. And what's really ironic is that Michelangelo had gained fame as a sculptor. He wasn't really known as a painter at this time. And what's the ironic part is that there were two other artists who were really jealous of Michelangelo and his gaining fame or newfound fame as a sculptor. And so they actually put his name forth to the Pope as somebody to consider to do this ceiling. And one of those artists was Raphael, in fact. And so Michelangelo is chosen, and in 1508 he begins the process of painting. It's going to take 4 years till 1512. Much of that time he's going to be lying on a scaffold, inches from the ceiling. And in fact, I read once that by the time he finished, he was so crippled because of lying in one position for so long that it was very difficult for him to function. But ironically, he does finish. This becomes this breathtaking work of art, known the world around, and he kind of had the last laugh, I guess you could say. And here you see a close-up. The ceiling depicts scenes from the Bible, and one of the most famous scenes is this: God reaching out to Adam with the spark of life. Here you see one of Michelangelo's sculptures, the Pieta, which depicts Mary and Jesus after the crucifixion. And as I said earlier, artists of the Renaissance studied the human form. They wanted to get everything right and make their pieces of art, their works of art, as lifelike as possible. So, notice here the draping of her clothing, the fluidity of the bodies. This looks real. Here we see another one of the great works of art of the Renaissance, The Last Supper by Leonardo da Vinci, which I don't know if a lot of you know this. This was actually painted on the wall of a chapel, but it's one of the most reproduced pieces of art of the Renaissance. And something interesting about this, a lot of artists would depict parts of their pieces of their own time period, their own era, into their paintings. And so if you look at this, you notice elements of the Renaissance that obviously would not have been present during Jesus's time. The room itself is a room in the style of the period during which Da Vinci lived. During Jesus' time, they would not have sat on chairs at a table with a white tablecloth. They would have been sitting on the floor, reclining on the floor. And so elements of the Renaissance in what still is a beautiful painting. And then what might be the most famous painting of the Renaissance, the Mona Lisa. There's an air of mystery about this painting. One story goes that she was actually the wife of a nobleman, and he hired Da Vinci to paint his wife's portrait because this is something people did during the Renaissance. They wanted their portraits painted for posterity to show off their wealth, their power, their accomplishments. And so supposedly Da Vinci worked at this and worked at this and worked at this for much of the rest of his life, but was never satisfied with it and never quite felt that he had really completed it to perfection. And so he never handed it over to the client. The Mona Lisa has become probably one of the most imitated pieces of art of the Renaissance. And we see many different versions. As I said, one of the big ideas of the Renaissance is to show off, your status in society, to commemorate your accomplishments, and so we see portrait painting becoming really big. And here's another example, the two ambassadors, where we see them showing off not just their status in society and their positions, but their possessions. So Italy was the birthplace of the Renaissance, but as the years passed, the ideas and ideals of the Renaissance spread and took hold in other places like France, Germany, England. So why did it take a while for these new ideas to take hold? Well, in the mid-1300s, Europe was ravaged by the Black Death. The plague reduced the population of Europe and brought the economy to a standstill. Italy, as we saw, recovered fairly quickly and was soon the center of this creative upsurge known as the Renaissance. In Northern Europe, though, recovery was delayed for nearly 100 years. So only after 1450 did the North enjoy the economic growth that had earlier supported the Renaissance in Italy. Also, Italy's republican spirit did not translate to the North. The North had some just powerful, dominating monarchies that were taking hold of these lands, especially Spain, England, and France. And then we have the Holy Roman Empire that is still dependent on local princes for power. So we don't necessarily see the political aspects of the Italian Renaissance showing up in the North, but wealth and prosperity were on the rise in Northern Europe. We see the same trends we saw in Italy in the 14th century, and one of the trends we see is humanism. But in the North, there's a slightly different direction in humanist thought. Now, the Northerners became exposed to these ideas because as these monarchs are consolidating their power and their kingdoms, many of them are actually hiring scholars and artists from Italy to come and work for them. And so as these scholars and artists travel, they're bringing the ideas of the Italian Renaissance with them. And humanism, as I said, becomes one of the big ideas. But the Northern humanists were just as interested in the new knowledge and classical knowledge, but with less paganizing involved, meaning they're emphasizing religious themes, but not really looking towards the mythological aspects. They believed that the revival of ancient learning should be used to bring about religious and moral reform. So we see a different purpose to the Northern Renaissance. In its art and literature, the Italian Renaissance had plenty of mythological themes as well as Christian themes, but we see fewer of the mythological and classical scenes in Northern Renaissance art. We have in the North less a movement to replace Christian values with classical ones, which sometimes had seemed to be the focus of the Italian Renaissance. But instead, we see more interest in reforming Christianity in a positive light. So the Northern Renaissance, or humanism, came to be known as Christian humanism, in which individual human goodness and the capacity for learning was emphasized, but within a spiritual context. We see in the North greater levels of literacy. A lot of people of relatively modest means began to have their children educated, and literacy began to spread. Also helping in the spread of literacy was the new availability of books. And here you see an example of a piece of art from the Northern Renaissance. And another characteristic of art of the Northern Renaissance, other than the fact that you're going to see the religious themes, is that typically it was smaller than much of the art of the Italian Renaissance. The great works of the Renaissance and the literature of that time reached a larger audience than ever before. And the reason for this was a crucial breakthrough in technology, the development of printing in Europe. Now, the Europeans did not invent printing. The Chinese actually did this. But we're going to see a German man named Johannes Gutenberg who in 1450 invented a printing press that used movable type. And in doing so, he began a printing revolution that's going to bring huge changes to Europe. Books printed with movable type were cheaper and easier to produce than hand-copied works. So here you see what his press would have looked like. And before, the only way to print would be to have like a plate for each page of whatever book you're printing or whatever document, and you'd have to actually carve each word on there, which is very time consuming. And here you see another view. What Gutenberg did was he created a plate with movable type where you could just move the letters around to form the words that you needed and then ink them and print whatever you're printing. and this was much more time effective, is much faster. At the same time, we see the development of a new type of paper that's also much cheaper to produce. So the bottom line is that books become affordable. They become readily available. The first book printed on Gutenberg's press was the Bible. And as these books become more readily available, people are learning to read and write. They're gaining access to a broad range of knowledge as the presses churned out books on topics from medicine and law to astrology, mining, geography. So all of a sudden, people have access to information. And it's really interesting because when we moved from 1999 to the year 2000 and entered the new millennium, Time magazine, I believe it was, did a countdown of who they believed were the 100 most influential people of the last 1,000 years. And they named Johannes Gutenberg as number one, the number one most influential person, because of this revolution that he began in regards to printing and literacy. And printing influenced all aspects of life. It influenced both religious and secular thought. One English author wrote, "The preaching of sermons is speaking to a few of mankind, but printing books is talking to the whole world." So with printed books, educated Europeans were exposed to new ideas that greatly expanded their horizons. Now, there are two movements that are direct outgrowths of the Renaissance: the Age of Exploration, with explorers spurred on by the curiosity and new technology of the Renaissance, and also the Protestant Reformation. And really, without the printing press, Martin Luther's Reformation would not have been so widespread. The new printing presses contributed to the religious turmoil that engulfed Europe in the 1500s. And by then, many Christians could read the Bible for themselves. As a result, the ideas of religious reformers spread faster and to a larger audience than ever before. And more, what people began to see and believe was that the clergy seemed less and less worthy, and individuals were believed to be able to read and be able to interpret the Bible for themselves and not be dependent on an educated few to know what the Bible meant. And this contradicted what the church at that time taught, which was that you really need the clergy to be able to tell you what the Bible means, that people, ordinary people, were not capable of doing that. One of the central figures of the Northern Renaissance was Erasmus. He lived from 1466 to 1536, and he was from the Netherlands, but he traveled widely. Now, early on in his life, he joined the church, and he was a monk. And as a young monk, he read virtually all the classical works that were available in Latin, while also studying Greek and Hebrew. When he was 30, he began his divinity studies at the University of Paris, but ended up deciding not to become a priest. Instead, he became a traveling scholar employed by various royal patrons. And as he travels and as he reads and as he studies, he ends up helping to spread the ideas and attitudes of the Northern Renaissance, especially the ideas and attitudes towards scholarship and the arts and ethics. And one of the big things that he's known for is his attitude towards the church. Now, he recognized that there were problems within the church. He recognized the corruption of the church, and through his writings, he mocked the sham and the tricks associated with organized religion. Claims such as, if you pray at a certain moment, God will look after you, and you will acquire great wealth. He used his pen to call for reforms in the church. He challenged the worldliness of church practices and urged a return to early Christian traditions. In his best-known work, The Praise of Folly, he uses humor to expose the ignorant and immoral behavior of many people of his day, including the clergy. He taught that an individual's chief duties are to be open-minded and of goodwill toward others. And so he is known as a humanist, and he was a very influential writer and thinker. And many of his ideas are actually going to be taken up in the Protestant Reformation. He himself will not really become involved in the Reformation. He thought that the movement was too extreme, and he really was not a reformer, even though you could say that his ideas are the ideas of a reformer, because he's calling for church reform. But he becomes really one of the central figures of the Northern Renaissance. From Spain, we have Cervantes, and he wrote a book called Don Quixote, in which he gently mocks the ideals of chivalry. In this book, he is pointing out the ideas that nobles and the aristocrats are supposed to live by, and then pointing out that they rarely lived up to the expectations. And he and his work is important, or are important, because this is one of the first works written as prose fiction, the type of book you read if you pick up a novel. This is one of the first books written in that style, and so it's going to influence the development of this type of fiction. Thomas More was an English aristocrat, and he served as England's Lord Chancellor under King Henry VIII. And he shared most of the basic views of his friend Erasmus. About a decade before his rise to power, More actually wrote a book that became his most important work called Utopia. Now, he was an author, a statesman, a lawyer, but above all, he was a humanist scholar. And he also used his pen or his writings to press for social and economic reform. And in this book, Utopia, he argues that happiness can be attained on this earth. You don't have to wait till you get to heaven. But also in this book, he's presenting a thinly veiled criticism of intolerance, of materialistic greed, and war-loving among England's aristocrats and clergy. So Utopia depicts an island kingdom very similar to England, except that its people live in perfect harmony. They spend most of their time pursuing virtue. They don't own private property. They practice tolerance of each other's views, just so long as they recognize the existence of God. And they have no need or desire for the art of warfare. So, it sounds perfect, doesn't it? And so he's promoting the idea that, maybe if people work together, if you eliminate the corruption, the greed, etc., you can create a society along those lines. Now, sadly, Thomas More is going to be executed by King Henry VIII. Henry VIII will be the forerunner in the English Reformation. He's the king who had 6 wives and wanted to divorce his first wife, and the Pope wouldn't work with him on it. And so Henry ends up creating his own church, and he expected all of his government officials and advisors to sign the document that was created to make it official, and Thomas More refused, and as a result he was beheaded. But he is an example also of the Northern Renaissance. While Erasmus and More wrote mainly in Latin, many Northern writers used the modern languages of their countries. In towns and cities, the middle class formed a demanding new audience for works in the vernacular, and the middle class particularly enjoyed dramatic tales and comedies. So perhaps the greatest writer in the English language was William Shakespeare, and he can also be seen as a product of the Renaissance. He comes at the very end of the Renaissance, but Between 1590 and 1613, he wrote 37 plays that are still performed around the world. He set many of his plays in Italy and exalted the human figure through his emphasis on human feelings and thoughts. That is humanism. Shakespeare's love of words greatly enriched the English language. In fact, more than 1,700 words appeared for the first time in his works, including bedroom, lonely, generous, gloomy, heartsick, hurry, and sneak. So words that we use all the time didn't exist before Shakespeare. So why is all of this important? Well, the Renaissance is considered to be the beginning of the early modern era, the early modern age. And all of these works together signal an end to the medieval worldview. Church and God are not going to disappear. For example, Erasmus, even though he criticized the church, he would remain very devoutly Christian. But the Renaissance is going to tear apart forever the medieval ideal of the entire world being unified or united under a single Christian church. It's also going to lay the groundwork, as I said, for the Protestant Reformation and the Age of Exploration. And it's going to open people's minds to new ways of thinking that will drive them forward.